She was scrubbing a sink that didn't need scrubbing. That's the first thing you need to understand about Sophia. By the time Salvatore Moretti found her that night, she wasn't cleaning anymore. She was disappearing into the motion of it, hands raw under the water, because standing still meant looking at what was on the counter beside her. A photograph. Shattered glass frame, corners bent, one crack running straight through a little girl's face. Nobody in that kitchen moved. 12 staff members froze mid-task when the door swung open and Salvatore walked in, the man who owned half the port district and, according to whispers nobody said out loud, 3 judges and a police captain besides. He didn't raise his voice. He never had to. Rocco, his right hand for 11 years, stopped 2 steps behind him and read the room in half a second. Something was wrong, and it wasn't the kind of wrong that involved money or territory. It was Sophia. 26 years old, hired 8 months earlier through an agency that didn't ask many questions, and up until that moment, Salvatore could not have told you the color of her eyes. That's not cruelty. That's just what it means to run an empire built on distance. You stop seeing the people who make your coffee, iron your shirts, disappear into the walls of your own house. Distance had kept him alive for 15 years in a business that buried anyone who let their guard down. But her shoulders were shaking, and something about that cracked through 15 years like it was nothing. "Everyone out," he said. Quiet. Final. The staff scattered. Even Rocco hesitated at the door, glancing back once, jaw tight, before he followed the order he clearly didn't agree with. Salvatore crossed the kitchen alone. He didn't touch her, didn't offer some rehearsed line about it being okay, because he'd learned a long time ago that men who say it's okay usually have no idea whether it is. Instead, he picked up the photograph from the counter, careful of the broken glass, and looked at the little girl in it, maybe 6 years old, gap-toothed, held by a man whose face had been scratched out entirely.
"Who scratched this out?" he asked. Sophia's hands stopped moving. For the first time, she looked at him, really looked, not the downward glance staff gave him out of habit, but a direct, searching stare, like she was trying to figure out whether the question was a trap. "I don't know," she said. "It was already like that when I was given the photo. I was 4, maybe 5. He set it down gently. "Given by who?" "A woman at an orphanage in Palermo told me it was the only thing that came with me. No name, no note, just this." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she turned back to the sink like the conversation was over, like a man like him had no business hearing the rest of it. He didn't leave. That's the part the staff talked about for weeks afterward. Not that he'd found her crying, but that he'd stayed. 20 minutes, standing in a kitchen he'd barely set foot in, while a maid he'd never spoken to told him fragments of a childhood spent bouncing between 3 different institutions, a foster placement that ended badly, a scholarship to a culinary program she'd had to abandon when the funding fell through. None of it was said for sympathy. She wasn't the type to ask for it, and something in the flat, matter-of-fact way she delivered it told him she'd stopped expecting anyone to care a long time ago. Little did the household know that 20 minutes would rearrange everything. Because here's the thing about Salvatore Moretti. The version of him the city knew was carved out of necessity, not nature. His father had built the organization on fear, and Salvatore inherited it the way you inherit a debt, not a gift. 15 years of never trusting a full sentence anyone said to him, of assuming loyalty had a price tag, of keeping every relationship at arm's length because arm's length was the only distance that had never gotten anyone killed. Sophia didn't know any of that history when she looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes and said, "You don't have to stand here. I'm fine."
"You're not," he said, "but you will be." He didn't know why he said it. It wasn't a promise he had any right making, but something about her, the way she held herself together with nothing but stubbornness and a wet dish rag, cracked something open in him that 15 years of controlled silence had never touched. Outside the kitchen door, Rocco waited, arms crossed, already calculating the danger in what he'd just watched. He'd seen plenty of men in their world get soft over a woman before. It never ended with a wedding. It ended with a funeral, usually 2. He had no idea how right and how wrong he was about to be. Because what started in that kitchen wasn't just a moment of pity from a powerful man toward a woman who'd had nothing. It was the first thread in a story that would eventually force Salvatore to choose between the empire his father built and the only person who'd ever looked at him and seen something other than a weapon. And buried in that shattered photograph, in that scratched-out face nobody could identify, was a secret that would connect Sofia to the Moretti family in a way neither of them could have imagined that night. But that comes later. First, you need to understand what it actually took for a man like Salvatore to let someone in. 3 days passed before Salvatore spoke to her again. He told himself it was nothing, a passing curiosity, the kind of thing that flares up and fades. Men in his position didn't have the luxury of fixation. Every relationship carried risk. Every soft spot was a door somebody could kick in, and he'd spent 15 years bolting every one of those doors shut. So he buried himself in work instead. A shipment delayed at the docks, a rival family testing the edges of his territory in the East End. Numbers, threats, the machinery of an empire that never stopped grinding. None of it worked, because in the middle of a meeting with 3 men who controlled half the city's construction contracts, his mind kept sliding back to a cracked photograph and a woman scrubbing a sink that didn't need scrubbing. Rocco noticed. Rocco always noticed. "You're somewhere else," he said, once the men had left and it was just the 2 of them in the study, the kind of room built for exactly this, quiet conversations that never left its walls. "I'm fine."
You said the same thing about the Castellano deal right before it fell apart. Rocco poured 2 glasses of scotch, set one in front of Salvatore without being asked. 11 years of working together did that, stripped away the need for permission on small things. "This is about the maid." Salvatore didn't answer, which was answer enough. "I'm not going to pretend I understand what happened in that kitchen," Rocco continued, "but I've watched you build this operation from nothing since your father died. I've watched you turn grief into discipline, and I've never once seen you let something in there that you couldn't control." He leaned forward. "A woman like that, soft, unconnected, no family to vouch for her, she's not a comfort, she's an opening. Every enemy you have would love nothing more than a way to get to you that doesn't involve a bullet. I'm aware of the risks, Rocco. Are you? Because right now you're not acting like a man who's aware. You're acting like a man who forgot what happened to guys who get soft in this business." Rocco's voice dropped. Not out of anger, but something closer to worry, the kind that only comes from genuine loyalty. "I've buried friends over women who turned out to be nothing but leverage. I'd rather bury a stranger than watch that happen to you." Salvatore turned the glass in his hand, watching the light catch the amber liquid. He wasn't a man who ignored warnings. Warnings had kept him breathing through wars other bosses hadn't survived. But something about this one didn't land the way it should have. "Noted," was all he said. It wasn't agreement. Rocco knew that too. Sofia, for her part, had no idea any of this conversation was happening. She went about her days the way she had for 8 months, up before dawn, finished long after the family had gone to bed, moving through the mansion like a ghost who'd learned exactly which floorboards creaked and which corridors to avoid during business hours. She hadn't grown up dreaming of any of this.
There'd been a version of her life once that looked completely different. A culinary scholarship in Florence, 2 years into a program that was supposed to end with her own kitchen someday, her own name above a door somewhere. Then the funding collapsed. Some bureaucratic disaster nobody bothered explaining to the scholarship students who'd built their futures around it. And she'd found herself back in an agency office in Palermo, filling out forms for domestic work because it paid, because it was steady, because steady was something she'd learned not to take for granted. The orphanage had taught her that lesson early, 3 placements before she turned 10. A foster family in Catania that lasted 4 years before the father lost his job and decided one less mouth to feed was worth the paperwork. She'd learned, the way kids in that position often do, to keep her expectations low and her bags half-packed. The photograph was the only thing that had survived all of it. She kept it now in a drawer in the staff quarters, glass still cracked, the scratched-out face still unreadable no matter how many times she'd tried to make sense of it as a child. Some nights she wondered if the man in the photo was her father. Other nights she convinced herself it didn't matter, that whoever he'd been, he was long gone, and the sooner she stopped chasing ghosts, the sooner she could build something that actually belonged to her. That's what made Salvatore's 20 minutes in the kitchen so unsettling. Not that a powerful man had shown her kindness. Powerful men could be kind in flashes, the way weather could be calm before a storm.
What unsettled her was that he'd asked about the photograph at all. Nobody asked. Nobody cared enough to notice the crack in the glass, let alone the missing face beneath it. She told herself it meant nothing. She was wrong. 4 days after the kitchen, she was refilling the study's decanter, a task she usually finished before Salvatore arrived for his morning calls, when their paths crossed in the hallway outside his office. He was reading something on his phone, distracted, moving fast the way men who ran empires always seemed to move. He stopped when he saw her.
"How's the shoulder?" he asked. She'd strained it 2 days earlier, lifting a crate of dishes nobody else had bothered to help with. Sophia blinked. She hadn't told anyone about the shoulder. She'd barely mentioned it to herself. "You have eyes everywhere," she said, before she could stop herself. Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, but close enough to unsettle her further. "I have people who report things," he said. "This time, I ask them to." He walked past her into the study, leaving her standing in the hallway with a decanter in her hands and a question she didn't have the courage to ask out loud. Why would a man like him bother asking about her shoulder at all? She wouldn't get an answer that day, but the question would follow her for weeks, long after the bruises faded, long after she convinced herself it was nothing, right up until the night everything about her life, and his, cracked open for good. 2 weeks slipped by before the next real conversation happened, and when it did, neither of them planned it. Salvatore found her in the mansion's east garden well past midnight, sitting on the stone bench near the fountain with a book she wasn't reading, the pages open to the same spot they'd been open to for 20 minutes. Insomnia had become a habit for her lately, a side effect maybe of the photograph sitting in her drawer, or maybe just the accumulated weight of a life spent never quite feeling settled anywhere. He almost walked past without stopping. Almost. "Can't sleep either?" he asked instead. She startled, closing the book. "I didn't hear you." "Most people don't. It's a useful skill in my line of work." He said it flatly, no pride in it, just fact. Then, after a pause that felt longer than it was, "Mind if I sit?" It wasn't really a question. Men like Salvatore rarely ask things they didn't already know the answer to, but something in his tone made it feel like one anyway, like he genuinely would have walked away if she'd said no. She didn't say no. He sat at the far end of the bench, putting enough distance between them that it read as respect rather than distance for its own sake. For a while, neither of them said anything. The fountain filled the silence instead, water hitting stone in a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, almost calming. "You've been avoiding me," he said eventually. "I work for you. Avoiding you isn't really an option." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." She did know it. She'd spent 2 weeks taking longer routes through the mansion, timing her tasks around his schedule, doing everything short of quitting to make sure their paths didn't cross again the way they had in that hallway. Not because she didn't want to see him, that was the part that scared her, but because she did. And wanting anything from a man like Salvatore Moretti felt like standing too close to a fire she already knew would burn her. "I don't know what you want from me," she said finally, honest, because pretending felt exhausting after 2 weeks of it. "You're not like the other bosses I've heard about. You don't yell, you don't..." She stopped herself. "Don't what?" "Rocco warned the staff when I first started, said you don't get close to people, said it's safer that way, for everyone." She looked at him directly, something she rarely allowed herself to do. "So why are you sitting here?" He considered the question longer than she expected. When he finally answered, his voice had lost some of his usual control. Not much, just enough to notice. "My father built this family on the idea that closeness gets people killed," he said. He wasn't wrong, exactly. I've buried men who trusted the wrong person. I've had to be the one who made that happen more than once. He looked at the fountain instead of her, like it was easier to say this to the water. "But I watched you in that kitchen, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, I wasn't thinking about territory or leverage or which of my enemies might be circling. I was just thinking about you. That's not something I know what to do with." Sophia felt her chest tighten, not fear, something closer to recognition, like hearing someone describe a version of loneliness she'd carried her whole life but never had words for. "I don't have anything to offer someone like you," she said. "No family name, no connections, nothing that makes sense in your world." "Maybe that's exactly why it does make sense,"
he said. "Everyone in my world wants something from me. You've never asked me for a single thing." They sat there a while longer, the conversation drifting into smaller things. Her aborted culinary career, the dish she still dreamed of perfecting someday, a simple lemon risotto her instructor in Florence had called the truest test of technique. He listened in a way she wasn't used to being listened to, without checking his phone, without the practiced patience of someone waiting for his turn to talk. Little did either of them realize that Bianca, Salvatore's mother, had been watching from an upstairs window the entire time. Bianca Moretti did not survive 4 decades married into organized crime and 30 years widowed within it by missing details. She'd learned to read a room the way other women read novels, quickly, completely, and with an instinct for which details mattered. And the detail currently mattering was her son, sitting in the garden at 1 a.m. with the maid, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. She said nothing that night. Bianca never moved on instinct alone. She moved on certainty, and certainty took time to build. So she watched and she waited, and she began quietly gathering information about a young woman named Sophia, where she'd come from, who'd vouched for her, what the agency records actually said about her background. What she found unsettled her more than she expected, because the records were thin, too thin, an orphanage in Palermo with incomplete files, a foster placement that ended under circumstances nobody had bothered documenting properly, and a name that, when Bianca cross-referenced it against an old ledger she kept locked in a drawer nobody else in the family knew existed, produced a flicker of recognition she couldn't immediately place. She'd seen that name before, or something close to it. She just couldn't remember where. Not yet.
But Bianca Moretti had built her entire life on patience, on the certainty that answers surfaced eventually if you were willing to wait for them. And something told her, some old instinct sharpened by decades inside a family that trafficked in secrets, that whatever connected Sophia to that ledger was going to matter far more than anyone in that garden currently understood. For now, she closed the drawer, turned off the light, and let her son have his moment by the fountain. It wouldn't last much longer. She'd make sure of that. Word of the garden meeting traveled fast, the way anything does inside a household where everyone's survival depends on knowing exactly what's happening under their own roof. Within days, the staff had noticed a shift. Small things, the kind only people who lived in close quarters would catch. Sophia humming while she worked. Salvatore lingering in rooms he used to pass through without a glance. Rocco noticed too, and this time he didn't wait for a private moment in the study. He found Salvatore in the garage, running a hand along the frame of a car that hadn't been driven in months, the kind of aimless task men do when their minds are somewhere else entirely. "You're not being careful," Rocco said, no preamble. "I don't recall asking your opinion." "You never do. Doesn't stop me from having one." Rocco crossed his arms, leaning against the workbench. "The Calabresi family is already asking questions about why you turned down their alliance offer last month. The Finucci brothers are still furious about the docs. You have enemies circling closer than you think, Salvatore, and now you've handed them a target that isn't even armed. Sophia isn't a target. She's a person. She's both, whether either of you likes it or not." Rocco's voice sharpened, not out of malice, but out of 11 years of watching Salvatore's back, of standing between him and every threat that had tried to take him down since his father's death. "You think I don't understand what's happening here? I've watched you carry this family since you were 28 years old. I've watched you make decisions no man should have to make, and I've never once seen you flinch. But this," he shook his head, "this is the first thing I've seen you do that isn't calculated, and that terrifies me, because everything else about our world is calculated. The people who want you dead don't take days off for feelings." Salvatore didn't respond right away. He kept running his hand along the car's frame, feeling the cold metal, the stillness of it. "I know the risks," he said finally. "Do you?" Rocco pushed off the workbench, closing the distance between them. "Because right now it looks like you're willing to gamble everything your father built, everything you've spent 7 years protecting, on a woman you've known for 2 weeks. "She's not the gamble, Rocco." Salvatore finally turned to face him, and something in his expression made Rocco go quiet. "The gamble is continuing to live the way my father lived, distant, untouchable, alone in a house full of people who work for me because they're paid to, not because they want to be here." He exhaled, slow. I watched him die surrounded by men who called themselves loyal and not one person who actually loved him. I don't want that. I won't have that. Rocco had no answer for that. Not because he didn't have concerns, he had plenty and none of them had disappeared, but because he recognized something in his friend's voice that he hadn't heard in years. Not since before Salvatore's father died and the weight of the family fell onto shoulders that were, at the time, entirely too young to carry it. Just be careful, Rocco said finally, softer now. That's all I'm asking. Be careful, for her sake as much as yours. Salvatore nodded, and for a moment it seemed like the conversation might end there. Two men who understood each other well enough not to need every word spelled out. Then Rocco added one more thing, quieter still. And watch your mother. She's been asking questions about the new maid, the kind of questions Bianca only asks when she's already 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. That got Salvatore's attention. He found his mother in the sunroom the following afternoon, a pot of tea between them that neither had touched, the kind of arrangement Bianca favored when she wanted a conversation to feel civil regardless of what was actually being discussed. Rocco tells me you've been asking about Sofia, Salvatore said, taking the seat across from her. Rocco talks too much. Bianca's tone was light, but her eyes weren't, though I suppose it saves us both time. What did you find? Not enough, yet. She poured tea she had no intention of drinking, a habit as old as Salvatore's memory of her. Her records are incomplete, which in our world usually means one of two things. Either she's hiding something, or someone else hid it for her a long time ago, before she was old enough to understand what was being hidden. And which do you think it is?
I don't know yet. That's what worries me. Bianca set the teapot down and looked at her son with an expression he'd seen only a handful of times in his life, the look she used to give his father, back when his father still listened to warnings instead of dismissing them. I'm not opposing this because I think she's unworthy, Salvatore. I'm opposing it because I don't yet know who she is, and in our world, not knowing gets people killed. She's not dangerous. I never said she was dangerous. I said she's unknown. Those are different problems, and only one of them can be solved with patience. Bianca reached across the table, resting her hand briefly over her son's, a rare gesture, given how sparingly she'd offered physical affection since her husband's death. Give me time. If there's nothing to find, I'll be the first to welcome her into this family properly. But if there is something... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Salvatore left the sunroom with more questions than he'd walked in with, and underneath them, a small, unwelcome seed of doubt he hadn't felt since the night in the garden. He told himself it was nothing. He was about to learn how wrong that assumption was. The threat arrived on a Tuesday, disguised as nothing more than an invitation. It came from Dario Finucci, whose family had spent the better part of a year testing the edges of Salvatore's territory, probing for weaknesses the way sharks circle before they commit to an attack. The invitation was for a gala, some charity function neither family particularly cared about, but attending was expected, a formality that kept the appearance of peace between houses that both knew peace was temporary. Salvatore almost declined. Then Rocco pointed out that declining would look like weakness, and weakness was the one thing they couldn't afford right now, not with the Finuccis already restless. So he went, and because appearances mattered, because a man in his position needed a reason to be there beyond business, he brought Sofia. It was, in hindsight, a mistake born from wanting something ordinary, one evening where she wasn't staff and he wasn't a boss, just two people at a party like anyone else. He should have known better. Men in his world didn't get ordinary evenings. They got evenings that looked ordinary right up until they weren't.
Sofia felt out of place the moment they walked in. The gown Bianca had reluctantly helped her choose fit well enough, but the room was full of people who'd spent their entire lives inside this world, and she'd spent hers scrubbing floors in it. She stayed close to Salvatore, not out of dependence, but out of simple math. He was the only person in the room who wouldn't look at her like she didn't belong. Dario Finucci found them within the hour. Salvatore? He extended a hand, smile wide and empty. And who's this? Sofia, Salvatore said. Nothing more, no elaboration. The way you'd answer a question you didn't trust the person asking it. Dario's eyes lingered on her a moment too long. Charming. New to your household? Recently, yes. How refreshing. I hear so much about the Moretti family's discretion, and yet here you are, out in public with someone new. His tone stayed pleasant, but there was an edge underneath it, the kind Sophia was learning to recognize even without years of practice in this world. Tell me, does she know what she's involved herself in? That's enough, Dario. Just conversation, old friend. Dario's smile didn't waver, but his eyes had already moved past Salvatore, cataloging Sophia the way a predator catalogs an opening. A man's weaknesses have a way of becoming public knowledge eventually. I'd be careful who you let close enough to become one. He walked away before Salvatore could respond, weaving behind a threat dressed up as small talk. Sophia's hand found Salvatore's arm without thinking. What did he mean by that? Nothing you need to worry about. Salvatore. She said his name the way she rarely did, direct, unwilling to be managed. I've spent my whole life being told not to worry about things that turned out to matter enormously. I'd rather know. He looked at her for a long moment, weighing how much truth she could carry, how much protecting her actually meant protecting her from information instead of just from danger itself. He decided finally that she deserved better than the second option.
The Finucci family has been testing my position for months, he said quietly, steering her toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. They're looking for weaknesses. Right now, that means you. Anyone I care about becomes a target the moment they know it. Then maybe I shouldn't be here. Maybe you shouldn't be anywhere near this world at all, he said, and there was real weight in it, real doubt, the first crack of uncertainty she'd seen in him since the kitchen. But I don't know how to walk away from you now that I've let you in. The admission hung between them, heavier than either of them expected. Before Sophia could respond, a commotion near the entrance pulled their attention. Raised voices, a scuffle quickly contained by security, nothing that concerned them directly. But it was enough to break the moment, enough for Dario to reappear at the edge of their vision, watching them with the patient interest of a man who just learned something valuable. They left early that night. Rocca was waiting when they returned, already aware something had shifted. He always was. Dario approached her, he said, not a question. He was testing the waters, seeing if she's a weakness worth exploiting. And now he knows she is. Rocco's jaw tightened. This is exactly what I warned you about, Salvatore. The moment anyone outside this house knows her name, she stops being a person to them. She becomes leverage. I'm aware. Are you willing to do what it takes to protect her then? Because it's not going to be gentle. The Finuccis don't play gentle games. Rocco's voice carried none of its usual restraint now. You may have to choose, and soon, between keeping her safe and keeping this family's position secure. Those two things might not be able to coexist much longer.
Salvatore didn't answer. He watched Sophia disappear down the hallway toward the staff quarters, her shoulders tense in a way they hadn't been an hour earlier, before Dario Finucci had looked at her like an opportunity instead of a person. He didn't have an answer yet, but he knew, with a certainty that settled into his chest like something heavy and permanent, that the easy version of this, the version where he could keep both his empire and the woman standing in the middle of it, was slipping further away with every day that passed. Somewhere upstairs, Bianca watched the car pull back into the drive, watched her son's face as he walked Sophia inside, and made a decision of her own. It was time to find out exactly who Sophia really was. She wouldn't have to wait much longer for an answer, because 2 days later, going through a box of her late husband's belongings she hadn't touched in over a decade, Bianca would find something that changed everything. A photograph, decades old, of a man holding a little girl with a gap-toothed smile. A face that had been carefully, deliberately scratched out of every other copy that existed. Bianca sat alone in the study for nearly an hour before she called for her son, the old photograph spread across the desk in front of her, alongside a ledger no one else in the family had ever been permitted to see. When Salvatore finally arrived, she didn't waste time on preamble. "Sit down," she said. "There's something you need to understand about your father and about the girl currently doing your laundry." He sat. 22 years ago, your father took in a child," Bianca began, sliding the photograph across the desk. "A girl, maybe 4 years old, the daughter of a man he'd done business with, a man who made an enemy of the wrong people and paid for it with his life. Your father felt responsible. He always did when the business claimed someone who didn't deserve it." She tapped the photograph. "He arranged for her to be placed anonymously, far from the danger that killed her father, with false records and no trail back to this family. He told no one except me, and even then only years later, when guilt finally got the better of him.
Salvatore stared at the image, the scratched-out face, the little girl with the gap-toothed smile. The same photograph, the exact same crack running through the glass. "That's Sophia," he said, though it wasn't really a question. "I believe so, and if I'm right, she's not just some maid who wandered into this house by chance." Bianca's voice, usually so composed, carried something almost unfamiliar, the weight of 2 decades of silence finally breaking loose. "Her father held shares in 3 companies your father quietly protected after his death, assets that were supposed to pass to his only child, assets that, as far as the courts know, still belong to an heir nobody has ever located. She's the heir. She may be the answer to a debt your father never got to repay." Bianca met her son's eyes. "Which means she's not a liability to this family, Salvatore. She may be the very thing that could free you from it." The conversation with Sophia that followed was unlike anything either of them had experienced before. Bianca laying out documents, old contracts, a network of protections her husband had built quietly around a fortune meant for a child he'd never gotten to explain himself to. Sophia sat through most of it in stunned silence, one hand pressed against her mouth, the other holding the photograph she'd carried through 3 foster homes and a childhood spent wondering who the scratched-out man beside her actually was. "He knew my father," she finally said, voice barely above a whisper. "He knew, and he still let me grow up not knowing any of it." "He was trying to protect you," Salvatore said. "Anyone who knew your connection to this family would have made you a target the same way you already are now, just for being close to me. And the money? Belongs to you. It always did." He reached across and took her hand, something steadying in the gesture, despite how unsteady everything else suddenly felt. "Enough to build the life that was taken from you. Enough, if you wanted, to build something far away from all of this." Sophia looked at him for a long moment, searching his face the way she had that first night in the kitchen, trying to read whether what came next would be truth or performance. "And what about you?" she asked. "What happens to you if I walk away from this house?" He didn't answer right away. He'd been asking himself the same question for days, ever since Dario Finucci's smile in the ballroom, ever since Rocco's warning about choices that couldn't coexist much longer. And somewhere in the space between the garden and this moment, he'd already found his answer. He just hadn't said it out loud yet. "I'm done," he said. "Not with you. With this." He gestured vaguely at the house, the empire, 15 years of distance dressed up as strength. "My father built something out of fear, and I inherited it because I didn't know there was another option. You've shown me there is." It took 8 months to dismantle what had taken 2 generations to build. Legal channels instead of violence, the recovered fortune used to buy out territory, settle debts, and quietly fund the transition of Salvatore's remaining legitimate businesses into something his father's old world would barely recognize. Rocco, once the loudest voice of caution, became the architect of the transition, his loyalty finally finding a purpose that didn't require burying friends. Dario Finucci made noise for a while. Men like him always did. But an empire with nothing left to threaten and a fortune large enough to make enemies irrelevant has a way of quieting even the loudest opposition. Bianca gave her blessing at the wedding, standing where a mother stands, finally at peace with the choice she'd once feared would destroy everything. Rocco stood beside Salvatore's best man, the same position he'd held at his side through every war that came before, now standing witness to the one thing worth more than any of it. Sophia wore white instead of a maid's uniform, and when she walked down the aisle of a garden that had once held a shattered photograph and 2 people afraid to want anything, nobody in that crowd remembered the woman who used to scrub sinks that didn't need scrubbing. They only saw a woman who had finally, after a lifetime of searching, found where she belonged. If this story hit you the way it hit me writing it, the kind of love that survives fear, empire, and everything in between, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories just like this one, and drop a comment telling me which moment got you the most.
Because sometimes the most powerful men aren't the ones who conquer everything. They're the ones brave enough to walk away from it all for one person who was worth more than the empire ever was.